obviously, before we can start using the various tools for passing data around and so on, we need to build a couple of these screens which we need. So here I am in a blank project again, and you find this blank setup attached to this lecture here. It's an empty Flutter project, just has the default main Dart file, slightly edited. I changed the text in the app bar here. And right now, if I start this application here on my Android emulator again, it will only have a centered text where I say navigation time. I also haven't added any specific theme here. I'm just going with the default settings of having a blue theme here, though these are all things which will adjust throughout this module. So we'll primarily, of course, work on making sure that we have navigation and so on, but we'll also, of course, make sure that we build a pretty application. So here's the dummy application, pretty empty right now. And the thing I want to start with is that starting page, which shows us various categories of meals, like Italian, veggie, and so on. And then the detail page for each category, which then in turn shows us the recipes for that category. That's the idea here. So in the code, I think it makes sense to start with that categories page where we see all the available categories, where we then can tap on one to see the meals, the dishes for that category. So it would make sense that this is our first new widget we add. And this will not only be a widget, it will also be a screen of our app. Now, technically, there is absolutely no difference between a screen and a widget. Every widget can be used as a screen. It only is a term that describes a widget which we use to control an entire page on our app, like the My Homepage widget, which we get out of the box. It controls the entire page we have here. Typically, any widget that uses scaffold is a page, as a screen widget. Again, not technically or as a hard rule, but since scaffold sets up the configuration for the entire screen, for the entire page, by adding an app bar and setting a body, this typically is a widget used in a screen widget. So let's add a new file which should hold this new widget, and I'll name this categories_screen.dart. The underscore screen part is absolutely not required. It's a personal preference so that we can quickly see that in this file we have a widget which we use as a screen. It's not a must use, but I personally like it a lot. Now, what should go into this categories screen then? Well, I'll create a stateless widget in here because right now the plan is to only output a list of categories. And I'll name this categories screen. So that's the name of my widget here. Again, to make it really clear that this widget is not getting used as part of another widget, but really to control the entire content of a screen. So the entire content on our device here on this in this app. Now, as always, when we create a widget, we have to import Flutter material Dart to get access to the stateless widget, the build context, the container, the widget class, and so on. And now the question, of course, is what do we return in this categories screen widget? Well, the idea here is to return a grid with all our categories. So a grid is basically like a list, but the difference is that in a grid we have multiple items sit next to each other, so side by side, instead of just from top to bottom above each other. We can simply build a grid in Flutter with the grid view. So we have the list view for a simple list where we have no items side by side, and the grid view if we want to have items side by side. Now, just as to the list view, you can pass children. And by the way, just as the list view, the grid view also has a builder mode, which you can use if you want to build a dynamic amount of items. If you don't know in advance how many items you'll have, or if it's a very long grid, and therefore you want that performance optimization where only items that are on the screen are getting rendered. For our purposes here, however, we can definitely use the grid view with a fixed amount of children because we'll not have that many categories. They'll also not change dynamically, and hence we also should have no performance problems. Now, I'll take care about the children here and the category items we're going to render in a second. Let's first focus on setting up the general look and structure of this grid, and we do that with another argument we have to pass. which also is mentioned here in this warning, we have to pass the grid delegate argument or parameter. So grid delegate is another named argument we have to provide, and the value for this looks really strange. It's a sliver grid delegate with max cross axis extend. That is a horribly long name. What does that do, however? Now, slivers in Flutter are really just scrollable areas on the screen. And of course, our grid, just like the list view, is scrollable as a default. Grid delegate, that simply means that for the grid, this takes care about structuring, layouting the grid. So this task of providing a layout is delegated away to this class here, so to say. Well, and with max cross axis extend simply means that this is a pre-configured class which allows us to define a maximum width for each grid item, and then it will automatically create as many columns as we can fit items with that provided with next to each other. So therefore here we pass a max cross axis extend, so the maximum extent or width of the tiles, so of the grid items, and here I'll use 200 pixels. And now it really depends on the device size how many columns we'll get in that grid. If we have a device with 300 pixels width, then we'll only have one item per row, and hence it will look like a list. If we have a device with 500 pixels width, well, then we'll have two items sit side by side. Besides this max cross axis extend, we can also define a child aspect ratio to define how the items should be sized regarding their height and width relation. And here I want to have a 3:2 relation. So of course you could just pass 1.5, but this expresses my extent way clearer. So for 200 width, I want to have 300 height in the end. And you can add some spacing, some cross-axis spacing of 20 and some main axis spacing of 20, which simply means how much distance is between our columns and rows in that grid. So with that, we are designing the look of our grid. Now we have to provide some children here, and that of course will be our categories. For that, I'll give you some dummy data, but first of all, I want to define how a category should look like. So now we'll add a definition of how the data we work with in this app will look like. And we did this earlier, if you remember, in an earlier course section for the transaction. There we provided a so-called model, and we'll do the exact same here. I'll add a new folder, models, and in there I'll add my category.dart file. So there I will define how a category looks like in this application. In the category.dart file, I'll create a class named category, and this will now not be a widget, so I don't extend stateless or stateful widget. It'll just be a normal Dart class, which I can instantiate. Now, how should a category look like? Each category item should have an ID, which is a string, so a unique identifier. I want to have a title, so the name of the category, like Asian or Italian, and then also a color, which will be used as a background color. Now, just as we did it before in this course as well, I'll provide a constructor, category here, where we can pass data for all these different properties. And color is a type that's not baked into Dart. Instead, this is provided by Flutter, so we have to import material Dart from Flutter. Now in the constructor here, I'll use named arguments, but of course you could use positional arguments as well. And then here, I'll expect an ID, I'll expect a title, and I also expect to get a color. Though for the color, I'll provide a default of colors orange. Also to practice this again, this is how you would provide default values for named arguments in case no value is provided for this named argument. I want to make sure that we always get an ID and a title though, and we can do this by adding @required, which is a decorator provided by Flutter, and it is, for example, included in the material Dart file. So since we have that import, we get access to this decorator, and now we would get a warning or an error if we tried to create a category without an ID or title. So this is how a category should look like. And with that defined, I'll add a new file, dummy_data.dart, which you find attached, which you can simply add to your project. And this contains a const variable here, which holds a const and therefore unchangeable list with some default categories following our model. Now, one thing which I need to do here, I need to import material Dart from the Flutter package so that colors is available here. Should already be part of the attached file though, so you will not have to add this. And now also important, we're getting an error here because I'm actually creating a const list here, which means this can't change. The values in the list can't change. And this is only accepted if each category object is also immutable. So if we can't go to a created object and after its creation change its color to a different value. And therefore we should go back to the model and add const in front of the constructor here. And now this means, since all these properties are final, the properties of an object can't be changed after the object has been created, and therefore we now really have a list where the values will never change. So that's just some dummy data, which I provide right now, since we have no server or database where we could get that data from, and you find this finished file attached. This file has all the data I want to load into this categories screen now to render the categories.